days unfolded in a way that lets you make an evening lecture. I know how many things can go wonky along the way when you're trying to do that. So today I will introduce aspects of 20th century archives of aging to explore historical perspectives on old age. So first, I'm going to discuss research published by newly established experts on aging between the 1940s and the 1960s. Second, I'll explore raw research data, including archived interview notes and questionnaires completed in the 1950s. What do these records reveal about elders' responses to health and welfare interventions? How do they tell a different story to expert accounts of old age? The mid-20th century was a crucial moment for the questions that this series of lectures addresses, including how and why aging has become associated with deficits, dependency, and disease. At mid-century, practitioners and researchers were asking the same questions as this series poses. Is there a way out of patronizing and pathologizing old age? How can we restore some of its dignity? In the middle decades of the 20th century, Britain expanded its welfare state and professionals and academics established new areas of expertise, taking fresh approaches to growing older. These new forms of state welfare and social intervention remade the public image of old age pensioners. Support for old age was vital to the reputation of the British welfare state. Yet the state's financial support for older people was patchy and usually insufficient. Professionals were slow to apply their latest insights to elder care within medicine, psychology, and residential homes. Despite this uneven support, state welfare transformed the lives of large numbers of British elders. State pensions introduced in Britain in 1908 alleviated the worst poverty among working people in later life. Residential care served much smaller numbers of older people, only 1 to 2%.
Slechts 1 tot 2% van de leeftijdsgroep van ouderen konden op die...
This talk identifies major tensions in the connected histories of state welfare, expertise, and growing older. Mid-century professionals and policymakers aimed to improve people's life chances and experiences at older ages. Their projects also contributed to stereotypes about older people that associated old age with deficits, dependency, and disease. So today I'll explore these tensions by examining the published archive of experts from the 40s to the 60s, by uncovering the interactions between experts and elders that were recorded during social research projects in this period, and by asking what social research archives can tell us about older people's personal approaches to aging. Britain's post-war age of expertise produced mixed legacies for growing older. The country's expanding welfare service required a constant flow of information to inform social policies and assess their effects. At the same time, the psychological and social sciences directed expert attention to the inner lives of older people. Post-war experts aimed to both understand the lives of individuals and improve collective experiences through welfare. As a result of this double focus, post-war research produced powerful personal testimonies alongside stereotypes and policy recommendations that limited the possibilities of Britain's later lives. Most medical, psychological, and social researchers focused on topics such as ill health and loneliness, and ignored elders' contributions to social and cultural life. The tradition of asking elders for their life stories had influenced 19th century journalists, reformers, and social researchers, including Henry Mayhew and Charles Booth. Booth, for example, studied pauperism in later life, using the life stories of people who were admitted to workhouses because of their extreme poverty. Like the officers of the Poor Law, however, Booth aimed to judge the causes of his subjects' poverty, rather than to understand much about their individuals' experiences. Booth's Stepney stories, shown in this image, were summaries of the lives of elderly paupers in a few short lines. There were feelings coded into these narratives, but the repertoire was limited to pity, shame, and hopelessness. Booth used a key to label each person's story with the main culprit of their destitution. The label D, for example, stood for drink, for alcohol. Z stood for old age. Rather than celebrating personal testimony, Booth wrote that there were, quote, few stories that cannot be forcibly expressed by marital condition, age, and 3 letters. During the 1920s and 1930s, psychologists and physicians newly addressed the inner lives of elders and made bold new claims about old age. In 1922, American psychologist G. Stanley Hall emphasized the individualized, even idiosyncratic characteristics of older people and their common desire to make social connections and contributions. A few years later, in 1925, British physician Leonard Williams identified later life as the ideal period for intellectual and spiritual achievements. These ideas failed to shape public perceptions of aging and old age, despite the growing popularity of the psychological sciences. The post-war boom in education and health and welfare services encouraged British experts to pay closer attention to older people's bodies, homes, and inner lives. From the late 1950s, newly established universities championed social planning and taught social sciences to expanding cohorts of students. By the 1960s, there was an almost 5-fold increase in social work students who learned how to apply psychoanalysis during their casework. Between the 50s and the 1970s, university social science programs enjoyed higher government funding, growing faculties, and research support by the newly established Social Science Research Council. Over the same period, expanding health and welfare services employed and promoted gerontologists, chiropodists, and occupational therapists who are committed to older people's well-being. Welfare services for older people were vital to the public appeal of a post-war system that supported Britons across the life cycle. Accordingly, British governments celebrated post-war philosophies of egalitarianism and democratic citizenship when they introduced new legislation for healthcare, residential care, and community care for elders. As Minister of Health, Aneurin Bevan proclaimed, quote, "The care of the old was not a family or individual problem, but a social problem that expanding welfare services could solve." Speakers in Parliament and at old age conferences affirmed Britain's collective responsibility for elder care and connected it to a set of post-war ethics that Matthew Thompson has termed, quote, "a kind of secular, human-centered spirituality." Marjorie Warren, who led the medical specialty of geriatrics, argued in the 1940s that services for the elderly should go far beyond medical treatment. They should keep older Britons, quote, "not merely alive, but also important, useful, healthy, and happy, and with as much enjoyment of mind and body as was physically possible to them." Similarly, physicians wrote in the early 1950s that Britons should enjoy, quote, "dignified, creative, and comfortable later lives." However, 20th century British governments designed and funded health and welfare services in ways that denied older people universal access. Architects had designed housing for older people since the 1930s, but most public housing projects served returned soldiers or young families. Physicians who championed new approaches in geriatric medicine established pioneering clinics. Outside their walls, however, older people's needs were poorly understood, and older patients were badly treated. Voluntary groups organised meal deliveries, home visitors, and social clubs, and had primary responsibility for these services until late in the 20th century. Older people benefited the most from medical advances and facilities that served Britons of all ages, such as the provision of spectacles and false teeth, and from the 1970s, hip replacements and pacemakers. Many elders identified the uneven provision of welfare services and felt sceptical about the benefits of state welfare beyond pensions. The professional and ethical interests of experts merged when researchers published socio-medical studies of later life that assessed the effects of welfare services and recommended new policies for aged care. By the second half of the 1940s, researchers focused on the ability of older Britons to complete a set of daily domestic tasks. The physician Joseph Sheldon, for example, calculated the percentages of elders in his surveys who were confined to their bed, house, or district, who had difficulty with stairs or queues, and who fell over because of vertigo or because they had trouble seeing in the dark. Sheldon presented a wealth of statistics on the physical limitations of old age and their panaceas, such as false teeth and spectacles. And we can see how Sheldon's study starts to contribute to these associations with old age. However, his study also reversed the assumptions of politicians who panicked about the increasing numbers of older people who lived alone. And I think these fears were still around in the 1960s. And we can see in this book cover that was published in 1963, featuring an older woman who appeared comfortable, but who seemed, the way she's gazing out of the window kind of implies that she's lonely, living alone. This trend began after the First World War, when the value of the pension increased and older people were able to retain the independence of their households and avoid imposing on their children. Politicians feared that British families were ignoring their responsibilities. Yet Sheldon's research described the close relations between generations living in different houses, whose occupants were, quote, independent in health and cooperative in illness. Sheldon judged that older people lived near to family members when a hot meal could be carried door to door without reheating. His statistics and diagrams demonstrated the important role played by relatives, whose contributions to elder care were far greater than public commentators gave them credit for. By the 1960s, researchers primarily measured elders' access to welfare and medical services. In 1963, physician Herbert Miller studied older people in his practice in the West Midlands to understand the delivery of health and welfare services in rural areas. Miller's focus on older people's health problems and difficulty accessing welfare services produced urgent recommendations for change and painted cramped portraits of subjects in their inner lives. At the top of his questionnaire assessing features of aging, Miller judged people's ability to leave their home, room, or bed, which he interpreted as a measurement of their loneliness and social isolation. During the next question, subjects' complaints about painful feet triggered further inquiries about chiropody and surgery. For medical researchers and professionals, older people's inability to, quote, stand on their own 2 feet showed their dependency and low self-esteem. In 1966, Jeremy Tunstall focused on Britons who were, quote, old and alone, often because they were single, recently widowed, or unable to leave their homes. The researcher hoped to portray, quote, the old person as a whole, by interviewing 195 elders and publishing a series of case studies. He applied psychological theories and created intimate portraits of the daily lives of subjects, such as Mr. Thomas, who Tunstall wrote, can get out of doors, but he can only walk slowly and has to stop frequently. He stands at the top of the street quite often. He has difficulty with climbing stairs and at present is sleeping on the ground floor. He has a bed in the front room. He admits he is short-winded. Cutting his toenails takes him a long time. When cutting them, he is afraid of having a dizzy bout. Tunstall wrote and structured each case study using the answers to a set of questionnaires that repeated Miller's concerns about mobility and physical decline. And you can see in the images here how the questionnaire topics about getting out of doors, going up and down stairs, getting about your house, etc., matched each study of the case study, even though that story sounded like a kind of free-flowing narrative describing a person's life. Together, such medical, psychological, and social research depicted later life as a cycle of household drudgery that was alleviated only by health and welfare professionals. Yet Mr. Thomas and his peers perceived the persistent problems and patchy provision of services. Mr. Thomas did not want to receive Meals on Wheels because he worried he would waste the food. He had been promised a home help who had never arrived. And he said that old people's clubs were too expensive to attend. And older people's experiences of residential care during the second half of the 20th century further illustrates some of the gaps between government's supportive rhetoric and insufficient investments in health and welfare services. Until the Second World War, public assistance homes and hospitals provided care for aged Britons inside former workhouses, and according to similar philosophies to the Poor Law. Before 1929, Britons entered workhouses due to desperate need when they were unable to find paid work or family support. This version of institutional living was despised by working class people due to its undignified, uncomfortable communal settings and the imposition of strict rules that separated families and ended personal freedoms and responsibilities. The post-war government introduced a new system of residential care and reimagined its ethics. Yet the 1948 National Assistance Act did not remove former workhouses, retrain staff, or change the attitudes of many of the people who lived and worked in homes. Bevan announced this legislation by ambitiously declaring the end of the workhouse. Now, he promised, older Britons who required residential care would reside in smaller, comfortable, quote, sunshine hotels with room for 25 to 30 people. The National Assistance Act prescribed that local authorities should provide residential housing for older people who needed it due to financial difficulty, ill health, or social isolation. However, Bevan had overstated what the Act and local authorities could provide. Authorities' new duties to provide residential care for elders was not matched by direct government funding, such as their care for children attracted. Instead, the state directed funds to the construction and improvement of buildings. This seemed an ideal way to demolish workhouses, but scarce building supplies and tight budgets prevented many large-scale building projects during the post-war period. Instead, authorities largely relied on former workhouses, charitable organisations, and private homeowners to house and care for elders. And a researcher, Peter Townsend, who I'll talk about in just a minute, took both of these photographs when he visited homes in the late 1950s, I think to really visually illustrate the difference between the kind of new vision and new homes, such as this private bedroom on the right, and what care was like in former workhouses, exemplified by this long, dark corridor shown on the left. Oral historian John Adams identified the end of the workhouse almost 2 decades after the legislation in 1965, when the residential home Luxborough Lodge, which was formerly a workhouse and a landmark in central London, closed its doors. Adams wrote that he could have chosen 1985, when the Camberwell Reception Centre, the final incarnation of the Gordon Road workhouse, shut. And that was nearly 40 years after Bevan's proclamation. In fact, the state had little influence over the day-to-day operations of institutions that it did not fund. And local welfare officers were similarly constrained. Welfare officers were reluctant to refuse or revoke a home's registration when so many people required care. Their subsequent involvement with homes proved, quote, extremely slender. Local authority inspections, for example, were described as, quote, little more than a casual conversation over a cup of tea. Meanwhile, the majority of residential home staff had gained their experience in pre-war public assistance homes or hospitals. Those among them who had trained as nurses were likely to prioritise medical treatments over social connections among residents. Moreover, residential care for the elderly occupied a lowly position in the professional hierarchy of medicine and came with frustrating working conditions that discouraged professional pride. During the 1950s, advocacy groups introduced courses on elder care. Yet only 20% of residential home staff had received such formal training by the late 1960s. This contrasted with post-war approaches to residential care for children that followed John Bowlby's psychological attachment theories and emphasised education for workers to protect psychic development in early life. So in the late 50s, in 1958 and 1959, the researcher Peter Townsend, who took these photographs, led a study of residential care in England and Wales that was called The Last Refuge. Townsend's research team visited 173 residential homes and interviewed almost 500 older people who lived there. Members of this research team had trained in the social sciences and were convinced by policy documents that appeared to guarantee Britons independence, dignity, and comfort in later life. In the published study, Townsend described his, quote, shocking first visit to a residential home and how it had dislodged his faith in the post-war project of, quote, building a bright new social Jerusalem. And these photographs are also taken by Townsend in homes. And I think they really illustrate how he was trying to use photographs to make some of his arguments about the damages of residential care at the time on the emotional lives of people who lived there. I think that the one on the left really evokes a sense of despondence by following these kind of slumped bodies. And then in the one on the right, it's kind of very impactful to be kind of viewing an older person through the bars. Older Britons themselves perceive the inadequacies and the horrors of residential care and describe the challenges of adjusting to institutional and communal living in later life. In Brighton, one man decried his home's cold interior, its burnt food, and the broken cistern on its shared lavatory. Others described dramatic scenes as they resisted demeaning practices such as shared bathing, by screaming and attempting to escape, or by staying silent from fright or resignation. Even those who enjoyed physical comforts such as, quote, beautiful surroundings, excellent food, and plenty of warm blankets, articulated significant emotional challenges. Living in unfamiliar surroundings with their domestic lives upended, older people in residential homes felt lonely bored and as if they were under surveillance. A woman in Berry wept when she was asked whether she would like to stay. And she said, quote, "Sometimes I feel I could go out and not come back." Others felt the constant, quote, draw of home. A man living in a home in Salisbury held out an arm and made a, quote, tense pulling movement to express his feelings of homesickness. Another Salisbury resident described how he sat at the local roundabout and waited for coaches coming from his home in the West Country, although he said they passed too quickly for him to spy any familiar faces. Meanwhile, workers often dismissed these complaints as the habitual, quote, grumbling of the old. Mid-century social researchers who were visiting these homes championed compassionate elder care and condemned homes and workers that fell short of their ideals. The researchers criticised residential home staff who discussed older men and women as if they were unable to hear. Ruth Townsend recorded a woman's displeasure when the matron of a home pointed to the beautiful embroidery she had created and noted her arthritic hands. The woman said, quote, "I'm the monkey at the zoo." Researchers were similarly aghast when residents stood up as they entered a room. This kind of display of subservience to staff and visitors implied that older people who required care were like children at school or like recipients of charity under the historical poor law. Seeing this happen, one researcher fled the room and felt, quote, hardly able to go on with the tour of the home. The last refuge researchers had not anticipated that the hierarchies of residential homes would interrupt their research process, including when older people looked, quote, nervously at the door for staff members who might overhear their interviews. Researchers suspected that they were being watched or, quote, harried by staff who pretended that they were serving tea or making beds. On these occasions, Townsend's study inconvenienced and disempowered the people that he hoped to help. The research team were really proud of their questionnaires with ageing residents, and they described how they wrote out the questions for deaf subjects and how they held, quote, quiet conversations with disabled people that won, quote, patchy responses when none had been expected. Still, older people's responses in questionnaires were briefer than the interviews with the managers, and they were boxed in ways that officials and managers' stories were not. So these images show the kinds of different records that were created when Townsend and his team interviewed officials and home managers compared to ageing residents. So on the left, we can see an example of some notes on an interview with a manager. These notes were 6 pages for this home, which was quite typical. And this is just one paragraph that kind of illustrates how expansive they could and kind of free-ranging they could become. And in contrast, the one-page questionnaire is what was completed with residents, with people who had recently entered old age homes. This took about 30 minutes, and the information that you see is all that was recorded. And unfortunately, most of these are not in the archives. And this was reflected in the published study as well, when the voices of people who advocated and cared for older people often drowned out the voices of the aged. And there were many more quotations and longer quotations from officials and managers. The last refuge study was published in 1962, and it contributed to a body of anti-institutional studies and reports that followed allegations about the poor living conditions in long-term hospitals. And it did get results. Shortly afterwards, local authorities began to close the largest institutions that Townsend argued housed elders in the worst conditions. Townsend advocated for the expansion of services that supported older people to live in their own homes instead. Governments agreed and hoped that community care would prove more affordable than residential care. but never provided the funding or resources to meet the needs of the oldest Britons. Skipping forward some decades, in the late 1990s, Paul Thompson interviewed Townsend, who was then aged 69 and 70, for a project on pioneers in social research. From the perspective of his later life, Townsend judged that he had been too worried about analysing social policies and that he had missed opportunities to record information about older people's early lives that was now lost. And he even considered that recording these personal stories would have done more to improve residential care. From the 1950s, social scientists lauded first-person evidence that was recorded verbatim. Especially by the 1960s, many researchers used informal interviewing to collect story-like narratives from their subjects. And this included Peter Townsend. In 1954 and 1955, Townsend interviewed just over 200 older people who were living in Bethnal Green in East London for his book, The Family Life of Old People. And in this project, Townsend created an archive of older age that looked different to his last refuge records. And this example does take us back in time a few years to the mid-1950s. So chronologically, it's a little bit odd, but I think we're kind of working here further outside of the norms of medicine and welfare. So these are some pages of Townsend's notes on his interviews with an older man, Charles Elwood. And I think that in this case, he used the second page shows a transcription that has probably come by using a tape recorder. But Townsend actually only used this in just a few interviews with the people he found the most interesting. And he was really interested in what Charles had to say about retirement and interviewed him multiple times. He actually preferred to rely on his memory to generate the record of an interview. So Townsend wrote notes during his interviews, and then afterwards he typed up a full account. And this starts to look like what you can see on the left, which is his very first visit to Charles Elwood. To Townsend's mind, an advantage of this system was his ability to, quote, select and order his data as he went, quote, in a way which would easily be accessible afterwards. So you can see on the left that he's arranging paragraphs by themes and uses those set themes for every interview. At the same time, he described, he would, quote, iron out the hesitations and the blurs and the half-finished sentences, aiming to, quote, recapture the way that people spoke. And this presents some challenges for working with the material because it sounds verbatim. It sounds like quotations from older people, but we can see from the process that there's lots of opportunity here for it actually to have been rewritten. Even 40 years later, in those interviews in the 1990s, Townsend had no qualms about the method and celebrated its efficiency in analysing and organising data. In its published form, which was in 1957, the book, The Family Life of Old People, concluded with policy recommendations in each chapter, for example, for employment, pensions, and housing. And this approach required streamlining the stories of the elderly. Townsend later regretted this emphasis, writing that his research, quote, tended to be a little too biased towards developing policy at the expense of recording more about older people's lives. Ageing Londoners embraced opportunities to tell stories about their lives, although some questioned whether policymakers would listen or would respond in time. When Townsend knocked on the door of Wilmot Street, home of 20 years to Rose and Charles Elwood, Mrs. Elwood opened the door only 3 inches and spoke to the researcher through the narrow gap. Quote, "What use is it to us?" she demanded. Townsend gave the, quote, rather hopeful answer that an interview with Charles, whose name the researcher had drawn in a random sample of older people from doctors' lists, would help to reveal the problems of growing older and help to improve old age policy. Rose felt sceptical. Quote, "I suppose we'll all be dead and buried by then," she said. Her husband, however, agreed to the interview and became a generous participant by speaking to Townsend multiple times for between 30 minutes and over an hour. And in their interviews, older people revealed new sides to the story of growing older. And I want to make some observations about how older interviewees challenged the association of old age with deficits, dependency, and disease when they were given the chance in these informal interviews and in the extensive notes that were then archived. So older Britons living in East London recorded a shrinking social and physical world that was constrained by their aching limbs, physical weakness, bouts of dizziness, or inability to stand, walk, or climb stairs. And so we can see how this would contribute to ideas of aging and deficits. But despite these limitations, aging Britons hope to contribute to paid work, family life, and household chores. So in 1955, James Alford named the exact date he had retired from his work as a market porter after 60 years of service, on the 1st of November, 7 years before his interview with Townsend. James reported that he had not wanted to give up the work, but found that it was, quote, getting too hard, and he was, quote, getting too old. Still, Mr. Alford continued to visit the market each day to perform, quote, odd jobs and earn, quote, a few shillings in a week. And this dedication to work earned older men the admiration of their families long after formal retirement. Likewise, families esteemed older women for their past and present contributions to family life. In 1955, Lillian Kempley was, quote, extremely self-conscious about her infirmity. Mrs. Kempley's daughter Marion had been lifting and dressing her elderly mother since Lillian had suffered a stroke and found herself unable to walk. At the time of the interview with Townsend, Marion could no longer manage to move Lillian from her armchair, where the aged woman now lived and slept. Social researchers worried that such infirmity was inseparable from isolation and loneliness. Mrs. Kempley contradicted that claim. Quote, if I was lonely, I could have plenty here. They think I'm a wonderful mother. They think I'm wonderful not to grumble. Lillian's aging body restricted her to an armchair, but it also invited the care and admiration of her family. Mrs. Kempley's granddaughter hoped, quote, to take after grandma and have a large family. And part of the reason these stories are visible to us is that families were often around in the homes when older people were being interviewed and took part, so that interviews became a kind of conversation among relatives and with Peter Townsend, who did all of these interviews himself. So thinking then about older age and disease, in their interviews, aging Londoners routinely described their good health, despite the wide range of physical difficulties that caused them pain and disrupted their daily routines. Elizabeth Cole, for example, had back pain and moved around her flat precariously as she went, quote, from table to table trying to keep going. Asked about her health, however, Elizabeth said, quote, I'm all right in myself. Sarah Hubbard, who had cancer, suggested that, quote, I'm not ill in myself, it's just the growth. Sophie Simmons explained that her, quote, general health was, quote, good, but I've got arthritis badly. And Daniel Sparks reported that, quote, I'm fairly good in myself, but it's my eyes what worries me. Older Britons were likely to discount chronic conditions if they were able to maintain their everyday routines, independence, and contributions to home and family life. Underlining this message, older men expressed pride in their robust health, physical strength, and quick recoveries from illness. Andrew Holborn, who had been in Bethnal Green Hospital for 6 weeks after breaking his spine, told Townsend that a doctor commended his resolve to patients, quote, you be like this one, it's willpower that's getting him right. Andrew's wife, Florence, supported his story. Quote, I heard all about him from others there. He was always laughing and cracking a joke. Andrew even satirized the kind of maudlin behavior that he had avoided. Quote, "Well, it's no use lying there with a face like that," he said, as he gave, quote, "a very long and hideous expression." Older women described family members' shock over their illnesses and subsequent attentive care. Sarah Agomba, for example, described becoming unwell at the age of 76 as a dramatic event. She said, "Last January, I collapsed in bed. It was as if I had a blackout. I was there 10 weeks. It's the first illness I ever had." The actions of relatives confirmed the significance of the episode. Mrs. Agomba reported, quote, "My Sarah Ann put her coat on and came straight down here from Yarmouth. She said what a shock she'd had." Other family members too came, quote, "rushing up," as they'd never heard of Mum being ill in bed before. Despite her 76 years and the fact that she no longer felt fit enough to climb the stairs of their flat, Sarah's temporary confinement to bed was presented as a shocking event in the life of the Agomba clan. Across social groups, older people reported that a key reason they wished to live longer into old age was to honour their financial and social obligations to others. So they really pushed back on this notion of older age independence. In 1942, for example, a 65-year-old writer for British research group Mass Observation anticipated the end of his life because he had, quote, "reached the age when death cannot be very far off." The man felt, quote, "ready for it and not afraid of it, and in some minds welcomed the idea of it. Yet he could not overcome his worries about his wife, who he feared would be, quote, "lost and lonely if I went, as well as, quote, very poor." The older Britons who Townsend interviewed also aimed to avoid disadvantaging their loved ones. Jane and Alfred Bailey, for example, were happy to consider living another 36 years to reach the ages of 100, so long as they were both healthy and financially independent. Jane said that she did not want, quote, "outside help." Indeed, quote, "life would not be worth living if she had to rely on her children." Instead, ageing Londoners hoped to contribute to the lives of their families, including through childcare. Frances Muckley and her husband William minded a host of grandchildren, quote, "generally 3 or 4 of them, on the weekends." The couple's interview with Townsend recorded the emotional benefits of their efforts when William said, quote, "the baby is keeping him alive." Later life featured experiences of bereavement that encouraged older Britons to describe their strong emotional bonds with family members and their distinctive experiences of grief and loneliness following the death of loved ones, especially of spouses. And I think that these stories really start to show us how older people are going far beyond the kind of medical and professional stereotypes. 9 years after his wife's death, for example, Alfred Harvey delivered an account of his loss that began, "She's always been something different from other people to me." Reaching back into their time together, he remembered that between the wars, quote, "she never grumbled, all the times when I was walking and walking, trying to get work." Despite this long history of affection, he mused, "You can't tell how you miss someone until they go." At the time of his wife's death, Alfred's grief was intense. "I don't know how I stood on my feet." Over the intervening years, he thought of his wife often. "There's not a day passes, but she's in my mind." He imagined her too. Alfred cried when he listened to couples in the dramas on the wireless, and sometimes he heard his wife calling from the next room. In his interview with Townsend, Alfred repeatedly returned to his belief that his wife was an exceptional person. His story showed that marital bonds could be particularly strong in old age, and that widowerhood provided reason to honour them in front of others. 20th century Britons described aging differently to statisticians and policymakers. Visited in their own homes, most aging East Londoners asserted continuities of later life that they viewed as more significant than the social and medical changes age had brought them. These elderly women and men spoke, for example, about their ongoing roles as workers, parents, and spouses. If retirement or death had intervened, then it was reminiscence and its domestic rituals that kept the past alive. In these contexts, aging Britons told stories that demonstrated the stability of self-identity in late life and that celebrated persistent character traits that ranged from resilience and industriousness to humour. The chances that older Britons had to speak about their lives were determined by their wealth, health, and family situation. At mid-century, older Britons with the least access to material and social resources were the most likely to live in old age institutions, and we've seen how that setting restricted opportunities to discuss their experiences, even when they participated in social research projects. Some people's experiences of aging were never put into words, archived or published. Charles Elwood had taught Townsend much about men's approaches to work and retirement, but his wife, Rose, was never able to articulate her feelings. Mrs. Elwood had fractured her legs and spine when she fell down the steps 3 years earlier, and she had hardly left their 2-room flat since. Charles described poignant scenes when he returned from days working on the railway. Sometimes I comes home and there she is, sitting in the corner of the room, and she doesn't say a word. She just looks at me. She goes on looking at me as I go about getting the tea, and I says, "What's the matter? Are you thinking how it was years ago?" And then sometimes she will burst into tears. I don't know how she stands it. Townsend did not push for answers when people wept or reported suicidal ideation, despite his, quote, great interest in their signs of suffering. He introduced a, quote, lighter note to the conversation to ease any immediate distress. Together then, researchers and participants determined what was recorded about aging, although the researchers always had the final say. The resulting archival records point to deep tensions in old age advocacy in the 20th century. Expert opinion about aging developed rapidly, but experts often failed to reshape elder care, and their ideas had some unintended consequences. Alongside their achievements, British welfare workers and social scientists introduced some damaging stereotypes that strongly associated aging with deficits, dependence, and disease. Older people contested these ideas when they got the chance. However, as their doorstep interviews were turned into social scientific studies, most of the direct contributions of older people slipped out of view in favour of those policy recommendations. Even in the heyday of social research, when social movements worldwide were bringing the voices of previously marginalised groups to the fore, the force of old people's testimony was blunted by political demands and by a continuing tendency to assume that other younger people knew best. And it was only as he reached the age of 70 himself that Peter Townsend wished he had listened more and recorded more of what older people had to say. Thank you.